How did you get into furniture making in the first place?
Well, oddly enough, when I was in school in Canada, we had industrial arts for the boys and home economics for the girls, and only for the last 2 years of primary school, so 11, 12 years old. And I discovered that I loved making things, and I actually won the school prize at the age of 12.
Did you?
For the industrial arts class. But I was also interested in music, and when I went to the next level up to high school, you could only take music or industrial arts, and I chose the former. And that's where the interest in making things ended for the time being. And it wasn't until I was in my 20s and I moved to this country from Germany, where I'd been living as a musician, that I decided I wanted to pick up on where I'd left off all those years before. So,
I mean, the fact that you've made a living out of two creative arts, music and woodwork, furniture making, I mean, it tells you that you're a very creative person. Does that come, were your parents very creative? Did you live in a creative household?
yeah, well, interestingly enough, both my parents were journalists, so they made their living by writing, a creative process. And my father originally, when he grew up as a child, he was a trumpet player, had his own little dance band, jazz band.
Wow.
And I think if times had been different, he might have pursued a musical career. But at the time, growing up during the war, it just wasn't possible, certainly not in Canada. So he became a journalist.
What took you to Germany?
Well, I trained as a musician in Canada, as a brass player, French horn player. And during my training, I became obsessed with the idea of going to Europe, the source of, as it were.
Yeah.
And I had made a couple of trips as a teenager to England with my family, and I just enjoyed the whole experience. So I finished my training in Amsterdam and freelanced in Amsterdam and Germany for a few years.
Now, you see, I can sort of understand that. I think lots of people from the continental United States, they would say going to Europe is something that lots of people do from America and Canada and Australia, from distant places, come to Europe, get the itch gone, fortnight, 2 years, 10 years maybe, but often will go home. Was there never a call to go home, or did you just kind of feel that this all fitted?
I think ambition to a certain degree dominated my my viewpoint or my approach at that point in my 20s. And I think the longer you are away, the harder it is to go back. And I thought often about going back, but I just thought certainly working as a musician, I couldn't have had the experiences and the lifestyle in Canada, simply because the cities are so far apart. Whereas you're in Europe, one day you can be playing a concert in Amsterdam, the next day in Berlin, the day after that in London. Whereas in Canada, I mean,
it's a week between villages, let alone cities.
I mean, obviously, with jets and airplanes and all the rest of it, it's not quite as much of an issue. But it was just a more congenial atmosphere, I think, in which to work as a musician.
But it's interesting then, at that point, that's a road path, isn't it? Being a musician in an exciting part of the world at an exciting time,
Yes.
What made you think, I want to go back to the thing I kind of started but didn't really get very far with, i.e. furniture making?
Well, what happened was I was living in Germany. This would have been the early 80s, I think, mid 80s. And I thought, I've kind of achieved what I want to in terms of ambition within the classical music business. I think I'll go to London and study singing for a few months. Just why not?
Why not?
Why not? I was working as a freelance in Germany and Holland, so it didn't really matter if I took 3 or 4 months off. And I've been here ever since.
Because what, you just arrived here and thought, oh no, this is me.
Yeah, I mean, on the one hand, because my mother was born here, I was able to live here without restrictions, without visas and things like that, which of course was an enormous advantage. And I think after I'd been here 3 or 4 months and I'd met some interesting people, I was still doing music at that point, and I just really enjoyed London, 85, 86. It was a different different place, I think, from what it's like now, and there are more opportunities as well. And so I just enjoyed my time, and one thing led to another.
And led to here, which is, you're in a kind of a community of craftspeople. Next door is a man that makes badges. There's a tattooist. I think you said that there's people that make other cabinetry work. There are musicians. There are the harp maker. It's kind of like a little creative collective here, really.
Yes, it is, and I like to think that it's part of the whole tradition of the area, Hornsey. Famous for its piano makers in the 19th century and early 20th century, and I think it's very important that cities maintain this sort of tradition of areas of craftspeople one way or another, whether it's, say, the fashion industry in certain parts of London, or the East End, where you get artist communities, jewelry, pottery, this sort of thing, and I think there's still pockets of those sort of things going on.
And it must be nice, because you must all feed off each other, surely, because the creative process, whether it be, what your parents did as journalists, or whether as a musician or a singer or a cabinet maker, if you are surrounded by like-minded people who understand that process, doesn't it help?
Oh, very
kind
much.
of acts as a muse, doesn't it?
It's one of the, that's my rent goes up steadily from one year to the next. Occasionally I think about moving out, but then I think of all the connections I have here. It's just extraordinary. I mean, we're constantly in and out of each other's workshops. I'll have Nigel, the harp maker, downstairs. He'll come up, say, well, I'm after a bit of this particular wood, have you got anything? I'll wander down to John, the other cabinet maker, saying, could I borrow your saw to cut up this enormous bit of MDF or plywood? And even when it came to the design of the coffin for Richard III, there's a chap upstairs, Paul, who's had a lot of experience in furniture design, and at one point I thought I need somebody to bounce some ideas off. Paul, can you come down?
I'm pretty sure that, you see, the thing about the Richard III story is how many people it kind of triangulates through. But I should think that from a career perspective, from his point of view, to be even involved in a kind of a tangential way must have been thrilling, I would have thought.
Oh, he's very he's well chuffed, as I think you say here.
Oh, come on, you've been here longer than I have, I think. So look, I mean, as far as the Richard III thing goes, I know that you've done many interviews over the last few years, but when you were growing up in Canada, was there any kind of family memory or history of we're related to Richard III? Nothing at all?
None at all. It's, I think, one of the more curious aspects of it all for our family is that my mother was very keen on the family history, and in fact her elder brother had done an enormous great family tree on the male side of their family, going back to the 14th century. And of course full of all kinds of interesting and not so interesting people. But she'd not done anything on her mother's side, which is of course the side that leads back to Anne of York, Richard's sister. So we had no idea growing up.
Which is extraordinary, isn't it? That work should have gone on, but on the male side, and it's actually, of course, on the female side that you trace your history back. Just for people that don't know, tell us what that connection is.
The connection is, basically, there's a direct link along the all-female line of descent from Anne of York, Richard's elder sister, I believe. And so mother to daughter, unobstructed, as it were, down to my mother, and to myself and my two siblings, as it were.
When you had, did you have a letter through the post? Did somebody phone you and say, Michael, we think you're related to the lost King of England? I mean, it's not the sort of thing you get through the post very often,
no.
is it?
No, that was fairly amusing in its own way. Basically, John Ashdown Hill, English historian, was asked to try and find an all-female link which preserves the mitochondrial DNA.
Which is the one that survives.
Which is what survives, yes. But it was not. It had nothing to do with Richard at that point. It was to do with Margaret, one of his other sisters, because they thought they'd found her remains in Belgium. This was back in, I think, 2004, 2005, and so he did this search, basically genealogical research, trying to find an all-female line down to the present day. And he found my mother living in Canada. and he approached her through. I'm not entirely sure whether it was by mail or by phone call, but there was a phone call at some point from John to my mother, informing her that she was related to Richard III. And by the way, could he have a DNA sample?
How did she take it? I mean, how did she break the news to the rest of the family?
Well, at first, I think she only talked to my brother, who has been involved with personal security issues and this sort of thing, data information protection, and said, look, I've had this call from somebody in England, claims that we're descended from a sister of Richard III, and he would like me to take part in this DNA business.
Because it sounds dodgy, doesn't it?
Well, it sounded dodgy, yes, but my brother did some research, and I think there was a triangular conversation, and shall we say, between John, my brother, and my mother, and they were happy to go ahead with what John had asked, and that's where it all began.
And it has been, a pretty extraordinary journey, and I know that you've said that you don't mind talking about it, but does it become a bit of a pain? Is it a pain that I'm here today talking to Michael Ibsen, furniture maker / descendant of Richard III?
Not at all. I mean, it's just an enormous, great privilege to be part of such a unique historical situation or sequence of events. I mean, who wouldn't want to be involved in all of this? It's really extraordinary. So, I'm more than happy to. I always find myself slightly surprised that people want to talk to me, to be honest. But I think what's struck me most of all over the last couple of years, in terms of what you just mentioned, is that whenever I go up to Leicester and I find myself chatting to people about the whole story, and this was right from the beginning, and just the level of interest in just people from all walks of life, and I just thought this is so important to the people of Leicester in particular, and also beyond that, people around the workshops asking me, when we next, what's happening? Even now people say, well, what's going on? Do you know any more about the reinterment? How's the design of the coffin coming?
Well, talk about the design of the coffin and what sort of broad plans are, and what that process has been like in a minute or two. But it's interesting how you talk of, that how important it is to Leicester, and I'm quite taken by the fact that those Ricardians who were involved in the search have all picked up on how Leicester has always had this sort of pride in knowing that Richard III was buried somewhere in the city, and the thrill, of course, of discovering the body, which is, as we've said many times on the programme before, the chances of that are so vanishingly small. To have achieved it is incredible.
Oh, well, it's absolutely extraordinary. I mean, I still can't get over the fact that he was found on literally the first day of the dig. I mean, what are the chances you dig a trench, roughly the area you think he's probably buried, and there he is? Extraordinary.
So when you found out, the early 2000s, that the family were related to Richard III, what did that become? Just an interesting family piece of history that you wheeled out at Sunday lunch occasionally, or did it become something more important?
I think at the time, we just thought it was an interesting family story. I mean, because a lot of people are related to famous individuals, one way or another. I mean, over the years, down to the generations. This, I think, was a bit different, but I think we're fairly lighthearted about it in one sense. I remember the first Christmas after this happened, my brother and myself were visiting, and we made my mother a little crown. And she took it in good humor. But I don't think we actually told anybody outside of the family. We mentioned it to cousins and this, that, and the other, but it was one of those things that you often come across people who are related to famous people, whether it's related to Winston Churchill or the Duke of this or the Duke of that, or somebody important within Canadian history. And we thought, well, this is just another example of that. But of course it all changed, first of all, when the issue or the possibility of launching an archaeological dig came up, and it suddenly took on a different sort of color. But by that point, my mother had died, so it was a focal point within the family was not there. So.
I would imagine that I mean I know at the time because I went down to the dig in the first few days, and I was speaking to the chief archaeologist there, and his phone it was almost impossible to interview him. And in the end, we had to switch the phone off because he was getting telephone calls from all over the world constantly. Were you similarly bombarded?
Yes.
Sorry.
In short, it really began on the day of the dig started. They very kindly invited me as a representative of the family, meaning my brother and my sister, to be there at the launch. And I was casually introduced to a BBC reporter and a cameraman as being, oh, this is the relative. And of course, relative, everyone's ears perked up. Of course, what they didn't realize that there are actually lots of people who are descended from the family of Richard III on a male-female line of descent. The all-female line, of course, there are only 4 of us. But at that moment, people suddenly perked up, and of course, when you've got one journalist who becomes interested, they sort of operate in flocks, as it were.
Well, yeah, I think that's probably fair. But of course, coming from a journalistic background, were you prepared for that?
I had a pretty good idea in terms of written journalism, print journalism, what it was all about, but it was still not so intense at that point. But when it was announced a couple of months later, or about a month later, that they had found remains, they weren't sure that they were those of Richard III. But of course, everyone thought, "No, goodness, this is possible." At that point, I got bombarded with inquiries and all the rest from the press and the media in general. And it's understandable. So I had a few days where I didn't get much work done.
And that's actually an important point, isn't it? Because we're standing in your workshop at the moment. It's not a huge space, but I am quite envious of it, if only because it is the most beautifully laid out workshop, everything in its right place, chisels in their right place. And the fact is, this is a really efficient place for making cabinet work. So, you know, it's all very well and good being tied up with, you know, all of that kind of stuff going on about Richard III, but at the same time, you've got to be making the lady down the street's kitchen or somebody's bookcase. You know, that doesn't wait, otherwise you don't keep a roof over your head.
Yes, well, I have to confess that yesterday it didn't look the way it does today. Obviously, when I'm in the
You've tidied up.
It. Well, I mean, on the one hand, I do like things to be where they ought to be because it makes for a more efficient work day, not instead of having to rummage around on a pile of sawdust and shavings trying to find that screwdriver or whatever it is, chisel. So especially in a small space, you have to be organized to be efficient. But yes, I did have, when the interest from the media was more intense, as in when something was found, and of course when subsequently in February of 2012, I guess, the announcement was made about confirming the identity of the remains. I really just had to write off short periods of time, which is a small price to pay, to be honest, for being involved in something that's so utterly fascinating.
I mean, of course, we know now, don't we, that lots of other people have rummaged around in their family histories, lots of genealogists have got stuck into this. And I forget what the figure is now, but there might be 1 million people that were descended or, you know, had some sort of familial relation with Richard III. But the point is worth making that clear line from his sister to you is the shortest, isn't it? In as much as there are only 4 of you.
Yes, as in terms of it being an all-female line of descent, yes, myself, my brother, and my sister, and this other line of descent, who was actually a distant cousin of ours. So there are 4 of us, and none of us have any children, although only the females can pass on this mitochondrial DNA. But neither my sister nor Wendy, the other line of descent, have children, and so when we're gone, it's gone. That link is vanished.
I mean, that's an interesting point. I was going to say what the effect it has on you, because it's all, you know, all very exciting, and I'm sure it must be thrilling. But at the same time, from a personal perspective, is there a moment where you sort of look back at that lineage that goes all the way through? I'm not talking about the royal lineage, but physically that number of people, one to the next, one to the next, one to the next. And the fact that line, because of this all-female aspect to it, kind of stops with you. Does that sort of bring questions of your own mortality into it, that we're one part in a, so the years will roll on after you, me, and everybody else?
Yeah, I think the two things that come to mind in that context. One is I was chatting to I think a chap who was doing some presenting for Channel 4 at some point, and I was saying, well, look, it's 17 generations from Anne of York to myself. It's a long time. And he looked across the street and he said, you see that bus queue? How many people are standing in it? And I said, I think there's 16. He said, it's not a very long line, is it? And I said, well, when you look at it that way, it isn't that long a line. And it hadn't occurred to me that actually 17 generations, yes, that's 17 people, but it's not that many in another or another perspective when you think of it. And then when you link that in with the idea that, well, this is it for this DNA, mitochondrial DNA link, this line, it ends with my sister and with Wendy. It does give you pause for thought in a way.
Of the many synergies that this whole discovery has found about people that have kind of come out of the woodwork that are connected to it in some way, one of the really remarkable things is that a reinterment needs a coffin. Wouldn't it be remarkable if the closest living relative should be a skilled cabinet maker?
Yes.
So when was that first mooted that you would create what's going to be a very famous coffin that will be, it will be anticipated that this thing lasts for probably 17 generations or more?
Yeah, I can't actually quite remember who first put the possibility forward. I think certainly Philippa Langley had a conversation with me at some point early on and said, wouldn't it be a lovely idea? And I thought, well, yeah, I'd be up for it. Be fascinating, absolutely fascinating to be part of that. But I think everything quietened down at that point, and it was the cathedral who ultimately approached me and said, would I be interested? And of course I leapt.
Yeah. Wow. And what happens then? So, because it's, I don't even know how much we can talk about it. I'm not sure whether, because it's all of us kind of a big secret, but what are the design parameters? What have you been told it's got to meet?
Well, basically it's got to fit into the vault in the floor of the cathedral, obviously, on the one hand, so that limits its overall size in terms of the largest possibility. But his remains are actually going to be contained within a lead lining, which also has to fit within the coffin. So we're constrained on one side by the size of the vault and the floor, on the other by the size of the lead lining, which will go into the coffin. Beyond that, I was pretty much given a free rein within certain parameters to come up with a design. My initial thought was to do a bit of research in terms of what his coffin might have been like in 1485 if he'd had one. And I was indebted to the good services of Dr. Julian Lytton, who I think is basically a knowledge expert in terms of English burial customs. And I had some interesting emails excuse me, from him. And he pointed me in the direction of a book he published in the early 90s about English burial customs, and I devoured that. In fact, it's...
Oh, is it?
Can
we have a look? Can we have a look?
Yes, yes.
Oh, wow.
Let me dig it out. The English Way of Death.
Well, that's a cheery read.
And what was interesting was, as I made my way through it, I realized that basically there's a lot of information that they've uncovered about the general ideas of how people would have been buried in the 15th century. But one of the more interesting things I thought was there are a couple of sketches of, first of all, what we're looking at here is the vault of Henry VII with his wife, along with James I. Now, I'm not quite sure what James I is doing in there with Henry VII and his wife. And if you've noticed that they're actually buried not in coffins, but in what they call a humanoid lead coffin, which I thought was quite interesting. So I thought, well, hang on, Henry VII didn't actually have a wooden coffin, or if he did, it was simply a means of getting him from one place to the vault in Westminster. And then further on, you'll see Edward IV in St. George's Chapel, and you'll see that his remains are contained within another lead container.
Wow.
And I thought, well, that's interesting. It doesn't appear that he had a wooden coffin either. So at that point, I thought, well, hang on. Although we have a lot of information about what the coffin, if he had one, would have been like in terms of construction, probably nailed together, made of oak, lined with Swedish pitch. But it's not a true coffin because he hasn't just died yesterday, as it were. But it's also not a piece of furniture. It's something in between, and that's where I started.
But to put this into some perspective, the importance of that is, in effect, you're doing something that nobody has ever done. Well, I mean, clearly nobody's ever done this before, but to create a royal coffin for a time when they didn't really have such a thing, when it's not a body, I mean, to put it crudely, it's a collection of bones that have been in the ground for, as we know, hundreds of years. There are different needs for such a thing, aren't there?
Yes, and that's what struck me when I first started to think about this particular commission in terms of precedent. Because initially I thought, well, I'd like to be as close to history as possible. But then two things struck me. First of all, it's the research that Julian pointed me in the direction of. Coffins weren't that common, even for kings and queens back then.
Really?
I think since then, obviously increasingly, I don't know how Henry VIII, Elizabeth I, I don't know how they were buried. I'm not an expert in all of that. But also, he's being buried or reburied, reinterred now, not in the 15th century. So can we not let something that's of today be appropriate for a burial that is happening today, in this day and age, as well as keeping certain aspects of the historical importance within the realms of the design, which is what I've tried to do. To be honest, I think, again, from what I've been able to gather from Julian, the coffin probably would have been nailed together. I'm not going to do that.
I was going to say, there's not a nail in this building. So, I mean, that's a really interesting and fabulous thing for a creative person to be able to do, isn't it? On the one hand, to keep an eye on the past, clearly. On the other hand, look to the future. But there's a logistic issue as well. This thing's got to last for a long time. So there's pure cabinetry involved there, isn't there, to ensure that the wood doesn't split, that the joints stay sound.
Yes,
how do you choose the woods?
Well, I chose English oak partly because it seemed, from an emotional point of view, if I can use that word, to be suitable. English oak, it's sort of the heart of England in a way. And I thought, wouldn't it be an interesting idea if we could source the timber from the Duchy of Cornwall? I thought, and it's just one of those wild bits of speculation that you get when you're lying in bed at night thinking, oh, what a good idea that would be. And I thought, no, not possible, it certainly wouldn't happen. But I thought, well, I'll ring Will up. And I rang him up and I said, Will, do you still have this link with the Duchy of Cornwall? Yes. I said, well, do you think they'd be willing to supply you with the timber? And again, great gales of laughter down the end of the phone. I said, well, that's an interesting idea. He said, because we actually process timber that's harvested from the estate and store it here for their own use. I'll have a word with the head forester and others at the duchy and see what they have to say. So about 3 or 4 days later, I got a call from Will and saying, yes, they think it's a great idea. I thought, wow, that's interesting. So December 5th, I'm paying a visit to the sawmill and to the duchy, and we're going to select out the timber that will be used in the making of the coffin of Richard III.
And will it all be oak from there, or will you use other woods in that as well?
It'll be solid English oak. The only other timber that I will probably use is on the inside of the coffin. There needs to be a substructure to contain the lead lining so it doesn't shift, it doesn't move around. And I thought I would use yew with its associations with the English longbows, although I actually tended to use French yew.
We'll scoot over that.
We'll scoot over that bit. Also the association in terms of it's usually found in churchyards. And also these trees, not the ones that are hacked down, chopped down, but they're thousands of years old, a lot of the yew trees. They have an ancient history within this country. And I think for me, one of the issues that's most interesting about the coffin is the symbolism of the wood that is going into the coffin. English oak. What could be more English than English oak? And yew, ancient timber. And then if we can source it from somewhere like the Duchy of Cornwall with its links, I just thought it makes a wonderful sort of circular story.
And have you done the design? Is this now a question of that's what we're going to make, now we find the raw materials?
Yeah, well, even before I'd finished the design, I knew that I wanted to use English oak. But the design is now finished and approved.
Can we even see that, or is that not?
I don't see any reason that you shouldn't see it.
Can I have a look? Yes,
it's
we'll have to have a
radio,
look.
so
Yeah.
let me just open up my little cabinet here. I can even show you. Let me see. There we go. It feels like a state document.
It does,
or
but it
like
feels
that.
like I'm being
Well,
shown a state
I don't
document.
know. I don't quite know what you'll be able to tell from it because it's just an
It's
elevation.
a schematic drawing, isn't it?
It's an elevation and a plan. So as you can see, looking from above, the lid of the coffin, which will have Richard III and his dates carved by hand in the top, and then a side view, you'll be able to see that the design is fairly simple in terms of how it looks to us.
It's beautiful, because actually what that does is that allows the material to speak, doesn't it?
Yeah, I mean,
I have to say, sorry to interrupt, but the craftsmanship, because there's no hiding. That's very simple and clean.
Yeah.
That means the craftsmanship, no pressure, has to be exquisite.
I'm confident in my own abilities, and I think because I've chosen to let the materials, the ideas behind the whole project take precedence. I don't think this should be about me. I don't want to make some incredible, cabinet-making masterpiece that takes away from the fact that it's a coffin. Yes, a coffin for Richard III, but I think one can achieve elegance and respect and all those sorts of things without being, shall we say, over-egging the pudding.